Welcome everybody for joining this Rudd Peterson Public Affairs webinar, which I've got a great panel today to discuss carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and utilization as well. The panelists are, first of all, the lady who's not with us, but we're expecting any minute, is Maria da Graça Carvalho, who's a member of the European Parliament and a former minister in Portugal. We have Luca Giasanti, who is here from Eni. He's the Senior Vice President, Head of Government Affairs of Eni, which is an Italian energy company. We have Giulio Friedman from Columbia University. Giulio, thank you for joining us. He's joining at a very early hour in the day, which to some extent, he's in California, by the way, and that is why the timing of this particular webinar is a bit later than the previous ones we've had. And then we also welcome Christian Weinberger, who is advisor at the European Commission, working for the Directorate General, which the acronym for which is GROW, but it's really industry and all things industrial. So welcome to you all. Now, I'm going to be assisted by a colleague of mine, Joanna Lepmetz, who's a consultant at Rudd Peterson Public Affairs with me, who will appear on screen in a few minutes. But first, I would like to thank our sponsor for this event, which is the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers, IOGP, and in particular, their Director for European Affairs, François-Régis Mouton. François-Régis, can I invite you to say a few introductory words?
Okay, thank you very much. Peter, I don't know if you can hear us.
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I want to thank our speakers as well for their kind participation. And knowing most of them, I know we are in for a good conversation indeed, as you said, Peter. As many of you know, the oil and gas industry is undergoing a massive transformation and investing more and more in clean technologies and carbon management solutions. The share of these investments is rising fast, and the COVID crisis has just accelerated this. We will use less oil and gas going forward. This is a question a lot of us are asking us. Of course, from about 60% of current European energy mix, it cannot be upwards, can it? Does this mean that we won't be using any oil and gas in 2050? Of course not. So the question is, how can we still use oil and gas and become climate neutral? Our industry has a long history of hedging its bets. We don't throw all our eggs in the same basket, which has a risk between assets around the world. This is how we are resilient during crisis. We are reassured to see the Commission abandon the all-electric narrative and explore other options, and recognizing the role of molecules like hydrogen. This is the only way to make sure we are reach climate neutrality. And CCS must be one of these options, perhaps not the one, but just one of them. But why is it still controversial? Every time we talk about CCS in public, I hear the same story. CCS hasn't happened yet because it's expensive, because it doesn't work, because it's dangerous. It will delay the deployment of renewable, and it will just lock us into fossil fuels longer. The truth is that none of these arguments are really true, except perhaps the one on cost, but even there, what is actually considered expensive? I've come to the conclusions of there are four main obstacles to CCS. One is a lack of awareness. There are projects in operation in Europe, and over a dozen more will be finished in the next 3 to 5 years. Second, regulatory barriers and a lack of incentive. 10 billion is the innovation fund versus 200 to 500 billion for renewable hydrogen alone in July strategy. Third, a lack of political will and vision for CCS. I'm hoping, by the way, Dr. Friedman can tell us more about this and talk about the successful initiatives in the US. False ideas are the fourth one. I hear crazy things like it can explode, or even we only have limited storage. First of all, CO2 cannot explode. And secondly, we have enough storage capacity for around 450 years of CO2 storage utilization in Europe. I think we'll be fine. We have industrial cluster in Europe. We have the infrastructure in place. We have the expertise. We can develop entire value chain, new jobs, just like the green jobs we developed with renewables, while keeping industry and R&D in Europe. Our industry is ready, working on it, and already working on it, in fact, but we need the political support of our leaders to make it happen. Thanks for listening to us. Thanks for listening to all our speakers now. And on behalf of IOGP, I wish everyone an excellent webinar, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, François Régis. And you'll be listening all the time, even if you disappear now, because Joanna will come and join me. Thank you very much for those remarks. And I'm pleased that I can see that Maria de Graça Cavallo is with us, at least in audio, perhaps. Are you there, Maria?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, I'm trying to get the image.
Right, the icon,
so
top left hand of your screen, there is a...
But this platform, as I told you, I apologize for the delay, but this platform is complicated for the Parliament.
Okay, but thank you. We will bring you in on audio because we've already got you there. So thank you for joining. I've introduced everybody. François Régis has just made a few remarks, and now we're going to start a discussion that will be in 3 parts. The first part will be about perceptions around CCS, exploring a little bit why people don't love it more. The second part will be on CCS and CCU technologies, the technologies themselves, how mature they are, how expensive they are, and how permanent the storage can be. And the third part will be the regulatory framework, what is needed to help CCS deploy. So everybody's on screen. Thank you for all of us joining in now. I will sort of pass the floor around. To kick off the first part, we have a poll. Joanna, if you'd like to launch the poll. This gives us as speakers a bit of a impression what you're thinking as participants, what your opinions are. To get the poll, to see the poll, you have to click on the little icon on to the right of your screen with polls. And there's a question, basically, why has CCS not taken off? And we've got a few suggestions as to why that might be. The options are there: public opposition, perception that it could prolong the fossil fuel-based economy, insufficient incentives, too costly. Of course, in reality, it might be more than one of these things, but please pick the answer that you think is the most relevant why CCS has not taken off. And Giulio, if I can ask you, perhaps looking at those results, we've got, can you see, Giulio, the sort of scores that are being shown?
Yes, I can.
We've got a sort of mostly people feel that there are insufficient incentives and that the policies are not up to speed. And there's quite a lot of people who also see this as a bit of a perception problem. Giulio, what do you think CCS's biggest reason is why it's not more loved?
Why it's not more loved is a complicated story. Let me say that a lot of people like brains and hearts and muscles, not a lot of people like livers, but livers are every bit as important as the others. I think that the last 2 items, insufficient incentive and too costly, are actually the same thing. And I understand why you break them out, but effectively the cost of CCS is not really the issue. It is the financeability, it is the price. Currently, Europe and other policy regimes around the world support much more expensive pathways because people like them. And those incentives have allowed us to do things like dramatically reduce the cost of renewables, supported nuclear power in France for many years, many other kinds of things. And by comparison, of the past decade of clean energy investment, less than 1% has gone to CCS. Yeah. It simply has not received the investment that's necessary to get deployment. So when people say, well, we've spent all this money and it hasn't deployed, that's sort of like saying, well, no, you haven't spent the money, and you also haven't fed your plant and it hasn't grown. So if you want it to appear, we know how to do that. I do want to talk very briefly, though, about the perception issue, because that's real. I think it's a false dichotomy. We know from the IPCC that we are out of time and we simply need to do more of everything. As you said, you have 250 billion euros of support for green hydrogen and, a 10 billion euro innovation fund, it's hard to say that CCS is taking away from renewables. But there is that perception, and that perception is real. And there's a perception as well that CCS is tied inevitably to fossil fuel and its future. I would contest that, but that's good enough for now.
Yeah, thank you, Giulio. That's good. Now, Maria de Grassa, you have been around in Brussels a long time. You've been in the Parliament in previous mandates, and you've been in the Commission for a while. And I believe you were working on CCS in the sort of 2007, 2008 period when the EU suddenly declared it was going to launch 12 CCS projects, of which none of them materialized.
Yeah.
Now,
yes.
Could you remind us why that might not have happened as planned back then?
So first, thank you very much for the invitation. And it's nice that you mentioned that, because is exactly to understand that process that we can draw some conclusions why CCS still today has a problem. At the time was just after the big crisis of 2008, and I was principal advisor of President Barroso, exactly with energy, climate change, and research and innovation. And there was the idea to have a big recovery plan, and we wanted to invest in projects related to energy and climate change. And the final decision was to invest in, were about 12, after was reduced to 8, but large demonstration projects in different parts of Europe with different technologies, slightly different technologies. And at the time I had, and I have to tell you, and probably now is easy to say, but you can believe me, I had this speech at the time. It was too early to go to this number of projects with the dimension of projects, was too ambitious. And in technology, you cannot jump the technological steps. We were going to, without having in some way mature technologies, we could have started with or smaller dimension or less projects and be less ambitious, could have been more useful for CCS today.
Okay.
Were different kinds of problems. Some were administrative problems, some were public acceptance. Rarely was technology itself, but was in certain way related with the technology maturity due to the cost. Of course, that you can say this is a circle, because if you don't have the market, you don't lower the cost.
Yeah.
But there is a certain degree of maturity that you need to achieve in order to launch, to start increasing, helping to increase the demand and the market. And after, if you are already in that level of the technological maturity, you can do that on the market. Probably we were a bit too early for that ambitious.
Right.
On the question of the image, I always think that is the CCS could be improve the image if you relate it, and I can talk about that in the second round, with the negative technology,
negative emissions,
and with the CCU. So you don't isolate the CCS. You put the CCS together with the biomass, with the CCU in a category of technologies that will allow, because it's going to be difficult to achieve the ambitious goals that we have today only by mitigation of the existing emissions. We probably need to have negative emissions technologies to withdraw the emissions from the atmosphere, but we can discuss a little bit.
Well, thank you.
Later on.
Thank you for that remark. Luca, if I may bring you in as someone from an energy company, you know, this COVID is creating a very difficult economic context for you oil companies, oil, gas, what, you know, you're an energy supplier, but that is indeed one of your sort of businesses. So can I ask, is this a good time for CCS projects if by companies such as yours?
Yes, it is a good time in the sense that in the case of Eni, we did announce publicly end of February the long-term strategy 2050, putting the company even further on the decarbonization path. And then it was really in the midst of the pandemic in May that we went public with this Ravenna project, which is a carbon capture and storage project. So we are working on it for some time, but we, in agreement with the government in Italy, we went public in May. The pandemic, of course, has affected us on both sides. I mean, the demand side and the supply one. But this didn't brought us to cancel any major investment projects. There will be delays on some projects, but we didn't change dramatically or substantially our long-term strategy. So we will continue to work towards a decarbonized energy world.
That's excellent news. And Kristin, if I may bring you in, you've got a nice poster behind you saying European Clean Hydrogen Alliance. And I know that you work on hydrogen, for which there's just been a big strategy developed. Now, your blue hydrogen is made from natural gas with the carbon being stripped out and stored. Is that right? I mean, basically, if you need blue hydrogen, surely you also need CCS. And is this a missing piece in the puzzle?
Well, in fact, as you can read, it's called clean hydrogen. And clean hydrogen, as we laid down in the announcement on 8th of July, means both renewable hydrogen, but also low carbon hydrogen. And as you rightfully say, low carbon hydrogen is hydrogen produced with a normal steam reforming process where you capture CO2 and whatever you do with it, CCS or CCU it. So this is included fully in the European hydrogen strategy. And the strategy also says that there is expectation that in the beginning it will even be the more ready, the more cost efficient, the more doable path towards decarbonization. Because of course, why do we do clean hydrogen? It's for decarbonization. That's very clear. Yeah. Now, I was surprised to hear the 200 to 500 billion amount that is being put forward by whoever, I don't know.
François Régis, I think you mentioned
yes,
that.
Yes, but I'm not sure it's really the Commission who put it forward. But in any case, if ever it is an amount, whatever the amount is, it's for clean hydrogen. So it's equally open for renewable and for CCS hydrogen. Right. And what we need is projects. So I think, I mean, I don't know, Luca, if you have actually also a refinery or if you buy your refineries are a big source of CO2. Refineries use steam methane reforming. So you could just go immediately to your government and say, here's my project, pay me the difference, and I will do CCU.
Yeah. Well, look, thanks a lot. I forgot to mention to everybody that there is an option, there is a possibility to ask questions in the chat function, and we have got a few. So, Joanna, perhaps you would read one out and just, I will attribute it, okay? Stand ready. But, Joanna, would you like to have a look at the questions and tell us if there's any that grab your attention?
Yes, there is one question related to the image of CCS, which is, even if CCS would remain tied to fossil fuels for the larger parts, will the overall economic, climate, environmental benefits of CCS be greater than if we only rely on wind, solar, and replacing fossil fuels?
Right. Giulio, do you want to have a go?
Yes.
That one, please.
The short answer is yes. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2015 found that solving the climate problem without CCS would increase costs to 140%, more than double. As one example to this, as we heard about the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance from Christian, the cost today of making green hydrogen in Europe ranges from $3 to $8 a kilogram, whereas making blue hydrogen is less than $2 per kilogram.
Yeah.
So the other thing is you start to hit infrastructure limits. If you try to do everything through electrification and through renewable power, you have to more than quintuple the global grid. It is a Goliath challenge. And it is simply cheaper, faster, and easier to include some CCS in the mix.
Great. Yeah, that is a good positive note. And we are looking for solutions. So this is and we're also looking for affordable solutions. So the cost efficiency is a very key parameter. Thanks, everyone. We might just move on with another poll. Shall we do that, Joanna? If it's already there, perhaps. This is the second part, which is about the technologies, and it's a bit about also what we need to do to make CCS attractive. What is it that needs to be? Is it the critical mass that a cluster can provide, a cluster-based approach? Or is it just advocacy, winning over governments, winning over politicians? Or does it require these sorts of policy incentives like funds, whatever, feed-in tariffs, whatever you can think of that might be allowed? That's the poll that's running. So please give us your questions. Maria, well, no, I'll come back to the poll. We've got actually quite a clear reply from the poll, and that's more than half of respondents seem to be looking at robust policy incentives are what's needed. That's an interesting one, because the third phase of our discussion about the regulatory regime, we're going to really try and scratch our heads and say, what policy incentives? That's going to be the challenge. Luca, why don't you tell us about your Eni's project, its nature and its state of maturity and things like that, just so that we get a grasp for what kind of incentive it might need? Is it, research innovation funding, or is it a technology that's more or less proven and you just need to scale?
Yeah.
Or is it market ready? Over to you.
Yeah, the technology, the CCS technology, I think it's proven, it's really mature. But as the poll shows, we all need still financing, incentives, and regulatory framework. Now, I mean, the Ravenna project, Ravenna, it's a city and an area situated on the coast of the Adriatic Sea in northern Italy. And that's an area pretty peculiar in the sense that Eni has been there for some decades now, 50 years almost. So it's an historic Eni presence through gas production offshore, power plants onshore, petrochemical complex. So it's an area that we have been growing consistently over the last decades. Now the offshore gas fields are almost depleted, and they can offer, and that the specificity of this project, they can offer a high storage volume there. Between 300 and 500 million tons of CO2 can be stored there. So it's a huge potential from these depleted gas fields. That will be, and that's an important feature in our view, the first CCS project at industrial scale in Southern Europe.
In Southern Europe.
Projects around the Northern Sea up to now, nothing for the South. We need to prove, I think there is a general interest from the EU institution, governments, and and the private sector to show that, I mean, these new energy projects can also be applied to the southern part of the continent. A second specific element of this project is that we can benefit from existing infrastructures still operational. This helps, of course, in terms of cost effectiveness. And then, as I said, the capture system will draw from a number of Eni's activities onshore and from other industrial activities which are there. Beyond CCS, this project will also provide a kind of second life to the region, because honestly, the local authorities, the employees, and the workers were really concerned at seeing the gas fields being depleted.
Yeah.
The present and previous governments freezing new exploration activities offshore. So this CCS project is giving a new perspective to the region in terms both of jobs and socioeconomic development. Then there could be a wider perspective. Beyond Ravenna, further inland, we could capture CO2 from other industrial sites. But in perspective, there is also potential to look across the Adriatic to our neighbors on the other side over time, I would say, to have them joining this project. So these are broadly the main feature of the Ravenna CCS project.
Right, that's great. So it's somewhere where the other CCS projects aren't. It's in the Mediterranean. That's good news. And it's mature, if I understand you rightly. You're ready, relatively ready, using existing infrastructure for some of the facilities. Maria de Grassa, if I can come back to you, you did some work on CCU in the Commission. I think you were in charge of the scientific advisory mechanism. Do you give equal support to CCS and CCU? Do you prefer one or the other? You did mention earlier. Your microphone. It's okay.
Thank you very much for this question. I was part of in the GRTD of the unit that had gave technical support to the chief scientific advisors. And because of my background, I was very much involved in the opinion, one of the last opinions that I did, or that I was involved before coming to the parliament, was exactly for DG Clima about CCU, how CCU, the question is CCU eligible for funding in the innovation fund? So it needs to be a clean technology. And when and in what conditions is CCU consider a project considered as clean? And of course, it depends on the circumstances. We have developed a full methodology with life cycle assessment and demonstration of additionality that clear criteria to be analyzed if a certain project is eligible for CCU. And of course, it depends if you are converting in fuels, that is, have a very short time, in chemical.
So you're using the CO2 to make a synthetic fuel.
That's synthetic fuel, or if you use the CO2 to make chemicals, it can be a larger time scale, or other kinds of materials, solid materials that you can be decades and to be more interesting. So we think that both CCS and CCU are needed, and in different conditions and for different things. We always say that CCU, and we have done a quite extensive literature review on the matter. The CCU will have a limited application in terms of the percentage of the removal of the emissions. But if we want to go to fully decarbonization of the society, we really need to also to have CCU.
Yeah.
And we need to have CCS. So it depends. Are we willing to stay with 50% of decarbonized, 60%? And if it's only that our ambition, probably the renewable electricity will be sufficient. But if you really committed to full decarbonize, there are sectors and there are projects that you need more complex and or more costly for the time being. They are more costly technologies, and there you need to have in certain conditions the CCS, and the certain conditions is better suit the CCU. We also analyzed the combination of the CCU with the use of biomass and the direct air capture in order to have the negative emissions. And I think that we need to more and more, at least from the scientific point of view and the research point of view, go along this path, because to fully defossilize the society more than decarbonize, because carbon is going to be always there, we hope. To fully defossilize the society, we really need to make use of all these technologies, and there are still some things that we need to invest in research and innovation. There is a policy incentive, but probably we'll talk that we are discussing inside the EPP.
That's for the next bit.
Some amendments, but I will
come back to that.
Round. Okay.
I had noted. Thanks.
Yes.
Christian, I'm going to move the conversation to you and just ask you a simple question: CCS or CCU?
Both. I mean, it should be a question of the case, and it should be a question of the costs, and it should be a question of the projects. I think, for example, it has been mentioned e-fuels, and I think when you talk about airplanes, e-kerosene is going to be the future for a long time. And that does need CO2, and so that would be CCU, but nothing is moving at the moment. That's the problem. Now, I think e-kerosene has, again, a cost problem, because e-kerosene is much too expensive compared to current kerosene, which does not include any cost that it has, social cost. So that there needs to be a bit of corrective on this, but I think that will happen. And e-kerosene certainly is one big user.
Exactly.
For CC. I think also, why not CCS? I mean, we need all the technologies, as has been said before, in order to reach the objectives. And I mean, let me repeat, I mean, the hydrogen strategy clearly says we will need, at least for the next 10 years, afterwards we'll have to see, CCU as a help to get enough hydrogen going. Or CCX, if you like, whatever, but both of them. CCUS. The point, and I repeat myself, the point clearly is one of costs. If you have an objective, and the objective is reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, then you have to attach a price tag to how many euros or dollars for Giulio do you need to get rid of 1 million tons of CO2, and that is then the deciding criterion. And the Innovation Fund is completely open to that, but you need to justify that. And if that can be justified, there's a business case. If it's really you can supply me blue hydrogen, Giulio, for $2 or euros, I think there's enough buyers there to take it. But I haven't seen that cost calculation in practice.
Let me just ask one question. I mean, you say cost is a very important criteria, but for many people, the permanence with which the CO2 is taken out of the atmosphere and stored must also be pretty important. Surely, I mean, yes, e-fuels, synthetic fuels in aviation are no doubt need to be used more, and I'm sure the Commission is thinking of it, because there's a new mobility, low emissions mobility strategy coming, and I hope that might figure in it. But the fact is, when the fuel is burnt at high altitude, you know, there is still CO2 coming back into the atmosphere, having been taken out once. Now that's better than putting additional CO2 in the atmosphere, but it's not quite the same as putting it somewhere where it will never come out. So
But
I just think
that's the difference between CCU and CCS, and to the extent CCU is easier to achieve, there's customers who buy the CO2 rather than having to pay a lot of money to put it somewhere. Well, why not? I mean,
Yeah.
it's about net zero. It's very clear. It's net zero.
yeah, I see it.
CO2. So there is clearly a market for both there, but it's gonna be the price per ton of CO2 saved. That's going to be the critical element in all these discussions. It's
Okay.
taxpayers' money. I mean, yes, many taxpayers maybe don't realize that it's the Green Deal is not for free.
Yeah. Okay.
There's been not an open enough discussion about it. But even if it's not for free, then it has to be cost efficient, and that's the name of the game.
Okay. Well, Giulio, you've heard an interesting few interventions there. I don't know whether I said at the beginning you're at Columbia University. I just want to say so now, and you're, in my view, one of the leading experts on CCS and no doubt CCU. So please tell us what you've heard, what you think about what you've heard.
So I look forward to doing the 10-hour version of what I'm about to say a different day. In the meantime, a couple of quick points. First of all, we're going to need all of these things. We will absolutely need CCU. We will absolutely need CCS. And if we can get more customers and more investment by starting with CCU, I'm all in favor of it. We have to cast a positive vision of what the future world looks like. And part of that will involve synthetic fuels made from CO2. To your point, Peter, some of that will eventually be pulled from the air. We have technologies to pull CO2 from the air. And if we do have CO2 from the air going into synthetic fuels, it's a circular carbon economy. And the EU is very focused on a circular carbon economy with some good grounds. I will say right now, we already know that doing that is about 4 times more expensive than pulling CO2 out of the air and storing it underground. We already know that the cheapest way to decarbonize aviation is to fly planes on fossil fuels and capture the CO2 from the air. We already know that.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I must admit.
And the reason why we don't know that is the only things in Europe that are measured in dollars per ton of CO2 are CCS and the ETS.
The emissions trading system, for those who...
Everything else is measured in euros per megawatt hour or euros per liter. When you start thinking about these things in a dollar per ton CO2 basis, CCS ends up being about the cheapest every time. And I want to say this in a very pointed and particular way. If you compare new builds of things, so for example, you want to compare a new offshore wind farm with a new natural gas plant, the new offshore wind farm may be cheaper on a dollar per ton basis as well as a dollar per kilowatt hour basis. Okay, but if you're talking about existing capital stock, if you're talking about decarbonizing existing facilities, it is almost always the opposite. It is almost always the case that CCS is a cheaper option than replacing an existing asset.
Wow. Yeah.
And because we haven't used a common measure, we often get confused about the real cost and the real value here. I wake up every day thinking about how to reduce carbon dioxide emissions in the air and oceans. That's it. All I do all day long, it's all carbon every day.
Yeah.
And if the goal is net zero, we have to have a reduction agenda as well as a construction agenda.
Yeah.
For a construction agenda, we should absolutely build things like zero carbon hydrogen. We should absolutely build things like more renewable power. We should build more efficient buildings. That's the construction agenda. But for the reduction agenda, we need a different set of thoughts and tools.
Okay, that's really interesting. Joanna, just could you check the question board and see if there is interesting questions on this sort of topic?
We have interesting questions coming in, indeed. For example, there's this one. Who will invest in the CCS for hydrogen production if the time horizon for economic viability is according to the hydrogen strategy for 10 years? Coming back to something we discussed before.
That's a good one. So I better put that to you, Christian. No, if the blue hydrogen, we're going to use it for 10 years and then we're going to be all green.
No,
Tell us.
wait a minute. The
Go on.
point is that in 10 years, the question is, will it still make sense to invest in blue hydrogen? And it may. But the point is not to say you have to turn off in 10 years the production of blue hydrogen. Not at all.
No.
But the point is, now for the next 10 years, it is the expectation. And I can tell you, we had lots of discussions based on tons of CO2 per, what is it, kilogram equivalent or whatever, in seeing what is the best means forward and how do we structure the hydrogen strategy. And the point is, yes, there is a potential there, clearly, using blue hydrogen to foster the agenda of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And therefore, and that's of course including CCU or CCS, you choose whichever is the better, more competitive option, and that will be for some time, is the expectation, blue hydrogen. And then you can of course use your plant after 2030. Nobody says you have to turn it off, but it's just a question that the expectation has been that after 10 years, renewable hydrogen will probably be the more cost-efficient option.
Yeah,
We'll see.
We will see.
Yeah, we'll
okay,
see.
Julio.
I disagree with the Bloomberg people on this.
Because
They are counting on two things. They are counting on really rapid reductions in renewable energy costs and really rapid reductions in electrolyzer costs. I think those are both in bounds. We certainly could have that. But right now we don't. And we do have ways to reduce the emission from existing hydrogen facilities today. And we can capture 98% of the CO2, and we know how to do that.
yeah.
And let's do that.
Yeah. Okay. This is interesting. So Christian was saying, we won't have to switch off the blue hydrogen plants after 2030. By then, we might have had to switch off the coal. I mean, there are some sorts of fuels where stranded assets might become a real issue. Indeed, it might already be being a real issue because we can't dispose of the CO2 in a sustainable way. Julia, just let me ask one supplementary question. We have to be brief on it, but is there an easier type of CCS project? Is it from a coal power station because of the quantities of CO2?
So the short answer is yes, there are easier projects, and no, they are not from coal stations.
Go on.
The easier projects are where there is a pure stream of CO2 today. The first and best place to do that today, Europe's hydrogen plants.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a great synergy.
The Porthos project, the Athos project in Rotterdam and Amsterdam are examples of that. The next best place to do it is at facilities like Ravenna, actually,
Wow.
where you have these big chemical facilities, fertilizer production, ethanol production. All of these are really good places to capture CO2.
Right, that is really great. And we're going to move the conversation on to the third part now, which is a little bit about the regulatory framework that we need to develop further. Shall we kick off with a poll? I don't know whether the poll is exactly on that. Let's have a go. Quickly do it. What regulatory steps would you most like to see? I know a lot of people will say all of the above, okay? But I'd like to know what your preference is, whether you would like to see ETS and trans-European networks have a non-pipeline transport, because it doesn't at the moment, whether CO2, EU incentives for CO2 removal technologies, everybody seems to like that for the moment. I can't believe that's going to mean, yeah, here we come. Other people are voting. A much higher carbon price, of course, and an expanded innovation fund. The two, to some extent, go together because the innovation fund is monetized allowances at whatever market price they are when they're monetized, when they're sold. We're definitely we're sort of going for the latter two. I would sincerely hope that the ETS directive is changed in such a way as it does enable non-pipeline CCS CO2 transport. That's just one of the things. This ETS, as it now stands, just covers pipeline transport of CO2 for CCS. But look, it's incentives and a higher carbon price that seem to win the day. That is indeed very good. So going to the panelists, Christian, I'll go to you first. I'm going to finish with you, Maria, because you're the real parliamentarian in the room. You're the one who decides. So we will come to you, if you don't mind, last. Christian, what about a CCS strategy? Is it done?
Well, some of the details that you have there, it's not my territory. This is the colleagues from DG Klima. I apologize. I don't want to escape this, but I don't know the details, so it's very difficult for me to argue this. But I just, nevertheless, the bigger arithmetics you say, yes, a higher carbon price will feed the innovation fund better, but the higher carbon price will also work in favor of green hydrogen. I mean, be aware of that.
Oh, be aware. I mean, surely we would like that.
So, so there is
Yeah.
pros and cons. So I'm not too sure. But in any case, the Innovation Fund provides a great opportunity, in my opinion. It's available now. It's open. You can apply now. Put your projects there. Green hydrogen project is not open at all. So put your CCS project there and get it in front of the jury by the end of October.
Yeah, there is an open call now.
Yeah. So
I'm sure a lot of people watching will be aware of that and be sort of on top of that. But indeed, if there aren't any, if there's people who don't know it, they should.
And that's a bit of the acid test. I mean, let's see which projects are there that are viable financially.
Okay, but this call is just €1 billion. It's not that big.
Don't worry. You know there is more billions behind, and you know that once the projects have shown to be good, and the first billion is not enough, the second billion will follow very quickly.
Great. You all heard that, people who are listening and thinking of applying for the money.
I mean, the Commission is in favor of reducing CO2 emissions, and that's what it's all about. So
yeah, but it's a question of
why are you surprised to say that there's?
I'm not so much surprised as there seems to be the need for more regulatory assistance or incentives. That's all. And I was just wondering what it could be. I think there will be some. I think the ETS will be reformed. We'll discuss that in the next webinar. And the price of carbon, in all likelihood, will go up. So there will be more money in the Innovation Fund. But I think we might need even more than that. Giulio, just coming across the Atlantic, the US has got 10 CCS plants up and running. What's the secret of success? You've got 10 times more, a million times. We haven't got any yet. We've got some coming. But tell us what the US is doing successfully and what we might learn from.
Happy to. Before I do that quickly, I know that you don't consider Norway to be part of Europe, but let me remind you that in fact there are 2 CCS projects operating in Norway and have been operating for 25 years. I understand that these were built in a different context with different funding and so forth. But the idea that Europe is somehow powerless to do things, I would take some exception to. What we have seen in the US is, back to the earlier points, if you have financial incentives, people build projects. It's not that complicated, actually. In the past, these financial incentives have been in 2 forms, either government grants or enhanced oil recovery opportunities. There are now 2 large policy incentives. One of them is a tax credit called 45Q. The other is a compliance mechanism in the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. Today, that's worth about $200 a ton. The tax credit is worth about $50 a ton. With that kind of incentive, we have seen over a dozen new projects announced. Wow. We are going to see an incredible renaissance. And let me say that many of these will be hydrogen projects. Many of these will be on heavy industry. They will be on steel mills and cement plants and ethanol plants. Some of these will be on natural gas power plants, and we've already had 2 natural gas power plants announced in the US to take advantage of these. It is not that surprising. It's hard to herd the cats, but you can move the feed bowl.
But the good news is you're doing it your side of the Atlantic, and I heard earlier, there are many projects in the pipeline on our side as well now, no doubt in the expectation of some sorts of help along the way. But there are projects that are about to come about. And apologies to Norway for not having sort of included them in the EU. I was thinking EU 28 or EU 27. Norway is the best of class. We know that. They've got 2 up and running successful CCS projects, and there may be more in future. There will, I'm sure, be. Let me go, Luca, just as a company. Are there any things that you are worried about that you'd like to see fixed before your final investment decision is made, or has that decision already been made?
No, the decision has been made, and I mean, we would not expect anything to be an improvement to come in before, but still, listening to what was said before by both Christian and Julio, what is needed also from a perspective of a private company or a public company is that really you need higher carbon price to make this kind of investment more attractive, but that alone will not be enough. You need subsidies, incentives, both at the EU and the national level. That's what the industry would need in Europe, at least. I mean, the same way in California.
Yeah, great. And Maria da Gracia, we come to you next. As I said, I didn't say to everybody that you're on the industry committee of the European Parliament, the ITRA. It includes research. You were a minister, I think, for science and research once. And you even had an important vote yesterday, I think, on the 2030 target, if I'm not mistaken, or the day before. Tell us what you think might help on the regulatory front.
I think that an important point that we are trying to push in the Parliament. First, we are discussing inside the EPP is the initiative of Mr. Andreas Kubilius and myself on the removal technologies target. So we think that will be very important to push for removal technologies in everything that is climate related. We need to do our own way, but I think that the idea is more and more accepted by the colleagues that is not enough to mitigate emissions, and we really need to go for negative emissions technology, and a target could be, even if it's not an obligatory target, but an indicative target could be to start with, to see what will happen, will be interest. We had some amendments yesterday by myself and Mr. Kubilius. Actually, he was Prime Minister for 10 years. But they follow because they were included in the compromise. Is a difficult mechanism of voting. But we will continue to push this idea. My second recommendation is about the Innovation Fund. In my view, the Innovation Fund is not enough for the big ambition and for the need that is required, and probably will not be enough to be based on the ETS and on the carbon price. You need much more funding, and probably, because you are aware, the big fight that we are having on the European budget, we will not have the possibilities to finance directly from the European budget to the Innovation Fund, but there is a way to make synergies with the recovery plan. There is an extra amount, a bulk of investment, very large, that will almost all that recovery plan is going to be led and managed and by the member states itself, exactly for projects, investment projects, and projects that are the first priority is the Green Deal, is how to do the greening of Europe based on new technologies, based on innovation, innovative technologies. So these projects are very good candidates in the member states, so they can have a link between the second phases or between the Innovation Fund and the recovery plan that is managed by the member states, because we really need much more funds than they are available in the Innovation Fund. And I don't see how we can enlarge, but not as the scale that is required by the ambition of the Innovation Fund, what is necessary for all these technologies.
Yeah.
So it's my two recommendations.
That's very helpful. I agree with you that the Innovation Fund in its present form is probably needs to be grown. And the good news is that the Emissions Trading Directive will be reopened, I'm sure, in June next year when the proposal is made to bring it into line with the higher target in 2030. And that will give an opportunity perhaps for the inclusion of more sectors, but possibly then a growing of the fund. But we will see. There is also something very important, I think, which is the Circular Economy Action Plan included an item which seemed to me very important, which was a regulatory framework for the certification of carbon dioxide removals. Seems to me that that's the sort of building block of something that would then give a company that sequesters carbon something, a certificate that they might be able to do something.
This is a very important point, like we are doing for the hydrogen. The question of certification will be also very important for the CCS.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it's on the agenda. Ioana, have we a sort of last question? We've got a few minutes left, not long.
There is a last question that I think can wrap up the discussion, and starting from the industry perception, is there a real political will in Europe to lead on CCUS technology, or do you think that Europe will remain lagging behind other regions?
So, well, I can quickly go through or ask all of you, do you think this time Europe's going to rise to the challenge and deliver them? Maria, would you like to just say a word?
I think that the best option is not to isolate CCS or even CCS with CCU, is to combine with the hydrogen strategies, combine with the full energy mix that we have, to the ambitious goals that we have of the fossilization of our energy system and of the society in general. And if you look at this in a whole, you will CCS and CCU are a very important part of it, and we need to push as part of this mix of technologies because we will need all of them. And now we take advantage of the hydrogen strategy to have a similar push with the CCS.
So, Kristin, are you happy? Kristin, you must be happy with that answer.
I'm not fully happy, I have to say.
Very quickly.
Happy with the Parliament to support this, but this issue about giving grants to get the industry going. Julia mentioned that. You also mentioned that a lot, Peter. We've had calls in the last years. I failed to remember exactly the name of the program, but it was the predecessor of the Innovation Fund, where there was not enough applications, even though the amount of money was smaller. So, in my opinion, the key thing in order to get Europe competitive is to take up these opportunities and go and run.
Okay.
Not complain about lack of this and
fair
lack
comment.
of that.
Fair comment.
Take the money that you can have, submit a good project, and run and do it, and that will help CCS, that will help CCU, that will help the European industry, and will be the world champions. Don't all the time talk about but before we start thinking, the Commission needs to do more. Sorry.
Thank you. Look, I was in the Commission till relatively recently, working on the NER 300 for a number of years, and there were 2 CCS projects that nearly were funded. But we just lost the commitment of the national government to co-fund, because there is, we don't fund everything. But anyway, this time it's going to be better, I'm sure. Luca, would you like to just make a quick remark on whether you think this time it's going to happen? You're obviously committed to that as a company.
We are. Actually, we are. But I agree with Christian. The time is now. We have the Innovation Fund. The first call is out there. We have the recovery plan at the national level. We have a full support from what we understand from the European Commission. We have been listening to Vice President Timmermans, Commissioner Simpson. Everybody is fully committed to support CCS as a part of the energy mix. So the time is now.
Giulio, as an outside observer, do you think we're going to make it this time? We're going to do better? Yes.
Predicting the future is difficult. Let me say that I sincerely hope you do. Like Maria said, I think combining and building constituency is the core opportunity here. I think you should reach out to organized labor that has a big stake in this. I think that the green groups can get behind a agenda that includes CO2 removal as part of a just transition. I think that there is a great deal to do. And I also think the Commission has many more levers at its disposal than it thinks. It's not just NER 300 or the Innovation Fund. You have the Common Facility Fund. You have many projects of common interest. There are commitments from national governments that are emerging in France, in the Netherlands, in the United Kingdom. I would encourage you to continue to be creative about how to build support for this, because if not, A, Europe will fail at its Paris agreements, and B, you'll be buying from other countries. I think you would rather succeed
We'll
at
do it.
and build yourselves.
I think we're going to succeed. But look, thank you to every one of you panelists for having taken part in this discussion. Thank you to the audience for having listened. And thank you to the IOGP and François-Régis Mouton for sponsoring the session. We will have a further climate talk discussion on carbon management later this month. And we look forward to seeing you there. We're going to be discussing things like the Article 6 mechanisms of the Paris Agreement, which is about collaborative agreements, offsets, and of course, the future of how emissions trading might evolve over the next decades, not just the next couple of years. So lots more to discuss. I look forward to meeting you all again virtually. And thank you very much, all of you panelists, for having participated today. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.